Sandra was so excited on the morning of her wedding day. She wore a beautiful white gown, and her heart was full of joy. The sun was just rising, casting a warm, golden light through the windows of the hotel. She felt like a princess ready to marry her prince. But as she entered the room where her soon-to-be husband was staying, her happiness quickly turned into shock. There, on the bed, was her husband-to-be, and her mother, Monica, was on top of him. Sandra froze, her heart pounding loudly in her chest. Her mouth went dry as she tried to understand what she was seeing. Finally, she managed to whisper, "Mom." Her mother, Monica, looked up and saw Sandra standing in the doorway. Her face turned pale with embarrassment. She quickly scrambled off the bed, and her husband-to-be looked just as shocked and ashamed. Without another word, Sandra turned and ran. Tears filled her eyes as she fled from the room, down the hallway. Sandra ran as fast as she could, her wedding gown flowing behind her. Tears blurred her vision, but she kept running, trying to escape the terrible scene she had just witnessed. Behind her, Michael quickly realized what was happening and ran after her. "Sandra, wait. It's not what you think," he called out, his voice filled with desperation. But as he rushed out into the hallway, he suddenly realized something: he was only in his underwear. Embarrassed, he stopped, turned around, and quickly ran back to his room to get dressed. Sandra, still running down the stairs, was in such a hurry that she didn't see her father, John, coming up. She bumped into him hard, nearly knocking them both over. John caught her, his face full of concern. "Sandra, what's wrong? What happened?" he asked, seeing the tears streaming down her face. But Sandra couldn't find the words. She was too shocked, too hurt. All she could say was, "Mom. Mom. Mom," as she pointed shakily towards Michael's hotel room. Then, without another word, she pulled away from her father and continued running down the stairs, her heart racing. John stood there, confused and worried. Something was very wrong. His heart began to pound with fear as he hurried to Michael's room. When he opened the door, what he saw made his blood run cold. Monica's clothes were scattered on the floor, and there was Michael, still in his underwear, fumbling to get dressed. Monica was there too, trying to cover herself up, her face flushed with shame. "Monica!" John shouted, his voice trembling with anger and disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Michael was too ashamed to meet his eyes, and Monica, feeling the weight of her actions, bent her head in shame, unable to look at her husband. The room was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of John's labored breathing as he tried to make sense of the situation. Sandra burst out of the hotel doors, her heart pounding in her chest as she ran towards the exit. She didn't know where she was going, she just wanted to get as far away as possible. Her wedding gown fluttered behind her like a ghost. As she approached the hotel gate, she didn't notice the car coming toward her. The driver saw her at the last moment and honked the horn loudly, but it was too late. Sandra, lost in her thoughts and tears, ran straight into the car. The car screeched to a halt, and the driver jumped out in a panic. It was Michael's father, Chief Nicholas, who had just arrived from a long business trip in the USA to attend his son's wedding. He couldn't believe his eyes when he saw Sandra in her wedding gown, running like she was being chased by a ghost. But before he could ask her what was wrong, Sandra had already collapsed, falling to the ground in a crumpled heap of white fabric. Chief Nicholas rushed to her side, his heart racing with worry. "Sandra. Sandra, can you hear me?" he called out, but there was no response. Her eyes were closed, and she lay still on the ground. Panic set in as he looked around for help. The security man who was standing nearby quickly ran over, and together they gently lifted Sandra into the back seat of the car. "We need to get her to the hospital, now," Chief Nicholas said, his voice trembling. The security man nodded, and they quickly got into the car. Chief Nicholas sped off toward the hospital, his mind racing with questions. What had happened? Why was Sandra running like that? And why was she all alone? Meanwhile, back at the hotel, Michael had finally finished dressing and ran out, hoping to find Sandra. He saw his father's car speeding away and caught a glimpse of Sandra lying in the back seat. His heart sank. "Dad, wait," he shouted, but the car was already too far ahead. Without wasting a second, Michael jumped into his own car and raced after them. Back at the hotel, confusion spread like wildfire. Bridesmaids, family members, and friends were all gathered, wondering what was going on. They had seen Sandra run out, her face pale and full of fear, and then watched as Michael and his father sped off. Whispers filled the air as people tried to piece together what had happened, but no one knew the full story. The joyful day had turned into chaos, and everyone was left standing in the lobby, filled with worry and unanswered questions. As soon as Chief Nicholas arrived at the hospital, he jumped out of the car and ran to the back seat where Sandra was lying. Michael had just pulled in behind him, and together, they carefully lifted Sandra out of the car. The hospital staff rushed over with a stretcher, and they gently placed Sandra on it. "Please help her," Chief Nicholas shouted, his voice filled with worry. The emergency unit quickly took Sandra inside, where doctors and nurses began to treat her right away. Michael and his father stood outside the emergency room, their hearts heavy with fear. Back at the hotel, Sandra's father, John, received a call. It was Michael, telling him what had happened and where they were. John's face turned pale as he listened, and without wasting any time, he rushed to his car to drive to the hospital. Just as John was about to start the car, he heard a voice from behind. "Wait, John, I'm coming with you," the voice said. John turned around and saw his wife, Monica, standing there. Her face was filled with guilt and worry, but John was too angry to care. He gave her a cold look and hissed under his breath before slamming the car door shut. Without saying a word, he drove off, leaving Monica standing there alone, her eyes filling with tears. At the hospital, Michael and his father paced nervously outside the emergency room. Chief Nicholas couldn't take it anymore. He turned to Michael and asked, "What is going on here, Michael? Why was Sandra running like that? What happened?" Michael looked down at the floor, too embarrassed to meet his father's eyes. He knew he had to tell the truth, but he was ashamed. "Dad, it's a long story, we'll talk about it later," he said, hoping to avoid the conversation for now. But Chief Nicholas wasn't satisfied with that answer. He placed a firm hand on Michael's shoulder and looked him straight in the eyes. "Michael, this is serious. I need to know what's going on, and I need to know now," he said, his voice firm. Michael took a deep breath. Just as he was about to explain, the doors of the hospital swung open, and John walked in. His face was full of worry as he rushed toward them. As soon as Sandra's dad, John, entered the hospital, he saw Michael's dad, Chief Nicholas, standing there. For a moment, the two men just stared at each other, their eyes filled with emotions that neither of them could put into words. Then, suddenly, Chief Nicholas broke the silence. "John," he shouted, his voice filled with a mix of anger and shock. John was speechless. He felt a deep sense of guilt wash over him. Just as he was about to say something, the doors of the hospital swung open again, and Monica walked in with Sandra's younger brother David. When she saw Chief Nicholas standing there, she froze, her eyes wide with surprise. "Nicholas," she gasped, her voice trembling. Michael looked at all of them, utterly confused. He had no idea what was going on. Why were they all acting like this? What was the connection between them? His mind raced with questions, but before he could say anything, his dad Chief Nicholas turned to him, his face serious. "Who are these people, Michael?" Nicholas asked, pointing to John and Monica. "Do you know them?" Michael nodded slowly. "Dad, these are Sandra's parents," he said. "Do you know them?" The moment Michael said that, Chief Nicholas's face turned pale, and he shouted, "What? This marriage can never happen. You will not marry Sandra." Michael was stunned. "But, Dad, why?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion. He couldn't understand why his father was so angry. What was happening? Why was his father so against the marriage now? Chief Nicholas clenched his fist, his mind spinning with the memories of the past. He looked at John, then at Monica, and his heart filled with anger and pain. He knew something that Michael didn't, something that made this marriage impossible. But the truth was too hard to speak out loud, especially in that moment. The hospital hallway was filled with tension, and everyone stood in silence, waiting for someone to explain. But all that could be heard was the distant sound of doctors and nurses working to save Sandra. The mystery between the families was growing deeper, and Michael knew that his life was about to change in a way he never expected. The tension in the hospital hallway was thick when suddenly, a doctor came in, looking serious. "Sandra is awake now," he said, "but she lost a lot of blood from the injury on her leg. She needs to rest." As soon as they heard the news, both families rushed into the room to see Sandra. When they entered, Sandra was lying in the hospital bed, her face pale, but her eyes were wide with fear. The moment she saw them, she started shouting, "Take me home. I want to go home, now." Everyone tried to calm her down. The doctor gently said, "Sandra, you need to stay here so we can take care of you. You've been hurt." But Sandra shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No. I want to go home. Please, take me home," she insisted, her voice trembling. Michael's dad, Chief Nicholas, was still demanding answers. "Why did Sandra run away like that?" he asked, looking at everyone in the room. Michael, standing by the bed, was just as confused. "Dad, why are you saying I can't marry Sandra? What's going on?" he asked, his voice filled with worry. Michael walked closer to Sandra and gently touched her arm. "Sandra, how are you feeling?" he asked softly. But Sandra pulled away from him, her eyes flashing with anger. "Don't touch me," she shouted. "You betrayed me. You cheated on me. And with my own mom." Her voice broke as she started crying, the pain too much to hold inside. Chief Nicholas's face turned pale as he heard this. "What?" he shouted in disbelief. He looked at Michael with deep disappointment, then turned his gaze to Sandra's mom, Monica. "How could you be so heartless, even to your own daughter?" he asked, his voice shaking with anger. Nicholas took a deep breath and continued, "You haven't changed at all, Monica. You did this to me years ago, and now you've done it to your own daughter." Sandra's parents, John and Monica, were covered in shame. They couldn't meet anyone's eyes. The room was filled with silence, heavy with the weight of what had just been revealed. Sandra and Michael looked at each other, their minds spinning with confusion. "Do you know her?" Sandra asked, looking at Nicholas. "What are you talking about? What did she do to you?" Michael echoed Sandra's question, looking at his father with wide eyes. "Dad, what do you mean? What happened between you and Sandra's mom?" The secrets of the past were beginning to unravel. The room was tense as everyone waited for Chief Nicholas to speak. Sandra, Michael, and even Sandra's younger brother all looked at him, wanting to know the truth. After a deep sigh, Nicholas began to explain, his voice heavy with sadness. "A long time ago," Nicholas started, his eyes distant as he remembered the past, "I was in love with a beautiful woman. Her name was Monica. We were very happy together. We even lived together in a small apartment. Life wasn't easy, but we were doing our best. I worked very hard to take care of her, to make sure she had everything she needed." Sandra, Michael, and her brother listened closely, their eyes fixed on Nicholas as he spoke. Monica, Sandra's mom, looked down, her face full of guilt, knowing where this story was heading. One day, Nicholas continued, "My best friend, John, who is now your dad, Sandra, had just graduated from school. He was looking for a job, but he couldn't find one. He was struggling, and I didn't want him to suffer. So, I invited him to stay with us, to ease his stress. I thought it would help him focus on finding a job instead of worrying about rent." Sandra and her brother looked at their dad, John, who stood silently, his face showing deep regret. "John moved in with us," Nicholas went on, his voice trembling a little. "I was working hard, trying to support both Monica and John. We didn't have much money, but I did my best to make sure we all had food to eat. I loved Monica so much that I wanted to make her happy no matter what." Nicholas paused, his eyes growing misty with tears, The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Everyone was hanging on his every word. One day, Nicholas said, his voice even softer, "I decided to talk to my uncle. He was a kind man with connections, and I hoped he could help John find a job. John had been searching for months but had no luck. I wanted to help him get back on his feet." Nicholas swallowed hard, the memory of what happened next clearly painful. "I left the house that morning with a hopeful heart. I talked to my uncle, and he agreed to help John. I was so happy on my way back home, thinking that everything would be alright. I thought I was doing something good for my best friend." Nicholas's voice broke as he continued, the emotion too much to hold back. "But when I got home, I found something I never expected. I opened the door, and there was John, my best friend, on top of Monica, the woman I loved more than anything." A gasp filled the room. Sandra's heart ached as she looked at her mother, who was now crying, her head hung low in shame. "My heart was shattered," Nicholas said, his voice cracking with pain. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The two people I cared about most had betrayed me in the worst way possible. I felt like my world was falling apart." Tears streamed down Sandra's face as she listened, her hands shaking. Michael and Sandra's brother were both in shock, unable to process what they were hearing. Nicholas wiped his eyes and continued, "I didn't know what to do. I felt lost, broken. I couldn't stay there anymore, so I left. I couldn't bear to see them together. I lost everything that day, my best friend, the woman I loved, and the life I had dreamed of." Sandra and her brother looked at their dad, John, who was now crying too. The weight of the past was heavy on everyone in the room. Nicholas looked at Monica, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. "You broke my heart, Monica. And now, seeing what you've done to Sandra, it hurts even more." Sandra couldn't stop crying. She felt as if her world was collapsing. The truth was too painful to bear. She looked at her mom and dad, not knowing what to think or feel. Michael couldn't hold back any longer. He looked at Sandra's dad, John, with confusion and anger in his eyes. "How could you do this to your best friend?" Michael asked, his voice shaking. "How could you betray him like that?" Before John could respond, Chief Nicholas interrupted, his voice filled with disappointment. "Shut up, Michael," he shouted. "I am so disappointed in you. Your fiancé's mom. How could you? You're a disgrace." Michael felt the sting of his father's words, but he knew he had to explain what really happened. Taking a deep breath, he began to tell his side of the story. "Dad, Sandra, please listen," Michael said, his voice trembling. "It's not what you think. I just came out of the shower when Sandra's mom, Monica, walked into my hotel room. I was surprised to see her there. I didn't understand why she was there, so I asked her if she needed anything." Everyone in the room was listening closely, their eyes fixed on Michael. Michael continued, "Then, out of nowhere, she started talking in a strange way, trying to seduce me. I was confused and told her to stop, but she wouldn't listen. Before I knew it, she started taking off her clothes. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to be rude or disrespectful to her because she's Sandra's mom, but I didn't want this to happen either." Michael's voice became more emotional as he went on. "I tried to stay calm, so I politely asked her to leave. But instead of leaving, she pushed me, and I fell onto the bed. I was shocked. Then, she jumped on top of me. I tried to push her away, but it all happened so fast. And that's when Sandra walked in, at the worst possible moment." Sandra's eyes widened as she listened to Michael's explanation. She could see the pain and sincerity in his eyes. She didn't want to believe her mother could do such a thing, but Michael's words seemed so true. Chief Nicholas, still angry but also confused, looked at Monica with disgust. "How could you?" he asked, his voice filled with bitterness. "How could you hurt your own daughter like this?" Monica couldn't even lift her head. She was too ashamed to speak, knowing that her actions had caused so much pain. Sandra was torn between her love for Michael and the betrayal she felt. Her heart ached with the weight of everything that had happened. She didn't know who to trust, what to believe, or how to move forward from this. The room was filled with silence, only broken by the sound of Sandra's soft sobs. Michael stood by her side, his heart breaking as he watched the woman he loved suffer. He wished he could take away her pain, but he knew that nothing would ever be the same after this. Everyone was left with more questions than answers. The truth was painful, and the wounds were deep, but the story was far from over. Suddenly, Sandra's body went limp, and she collapsed again. Everyone panicked, shouting for the doctor. The doctor rushed in and quickly checked her. "Everyone, leave the room now," he commanded. They all hurried out, hearts pounding with fear, and waited anxiously in the hospital's waiting room. As they waited, the atmosphere was tense. Michael was pacing back and forth, his mind racing. Sandra's parents sat silently, their faces pale with worry and guilt. Chief Nicholas stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Just then, the door to the waiting room swung open, and in came Michael's mom, dressed in her beautiful Asibi outfit. She was accompanied by a group of women who had been helping her with the wedding plans. They had all been waiting at the church, wondering why the couple hadn't arrived. When they heard that everyone was at the hospital, they rushed over, worried and confused. "Michael. What is going on?" Michael's mom asked, her voice filled with concern. She looked around the room, but nobody answered her. The tension was too thick, and no one knew what to say. She approached Sandra's parents, John and Monica, since she had known them well and had been working closely with them to plan the wedding. The reason she was so involved was that her husband, Chief Nicholas, had been away on a long business trip in the United States for several months. Because he was gone, the responsibility of planning the wedding had fallen entirely on her shoulders. She had spent countless hours talking to Sandra's parents, John and Monica, about every detail of the wedding. "Please, tell me what's happening. Why are we in the hospital instead of at the church?" But Sandra's parents remained silent, too ashamed to speak. Monica couldn't even lift her head to look at Michael's mom. Michael's mom grew more worried. "Why is everyone so quiet? What happened to Sandra? Someone, please tell me," she pleaded, looking around at the faces full of worry and guilt. Just then, the doctor came out of Sandra's room. His expression was serious. "Sandra needs blood," he said. "She has lost a lot of blood, and we need to act quickly to save her." The room fell silent. Everyone was worried about Sandra, but the secrets and tension hanging in the air made it hard for anyone to think straight. Michael's mom looked at the doctor, then at her son, her heart racing with fear for Sandra. Everyone knew that this day, which was supposed to be filled with joy, had turned into a nightmare. The story was far from over, and the challenges ahead seemed almost too much to bear. As the room filled with worried faces, Sandra's younger brother suddenly stood up. "I can give Sandra my blood," he said, determined to help his sister. Everyone nodded, hoping this would be the solution. The doctor quickly took him to check if his blood would match Sandra's. The family waited anxiously, hoping for good news. But when the doctor returned, his face was serious. "I'm sorry," the doctor said, "but his blood doesn't match Sandra's. We can't use it." Sandra's parents looked at each other in surprise. They hadn't expected this. Her dad, John, then stepped forward. "I'll donate my blood," he offered, his voice filled with determination. "I'm her father. My blood should match." The doctor nodded and took John to test his blood. Everyone waited, holding their breath, hoping that this time it would work. But when the doctor came back, he looked even more concerned. "The blood doesn't match," the doctor said, looking directly at John. "Are you sure you're Sandra's father?" The question hit the room like a thunderbolt. Everyone stared at John, confused and shocked. Even John looked stunned. "Of course, I'm her father," he insisted, his voice shaky. But the doctor shook his head. "The blood type doesn't match at all. We can't use it. This is very unusual." Now, the room was filled with even more confusion. If John's blood didn't match, what did that mean? Was there some mistake? Everyone was too stunned to speak, trying to make sense of what was happening. Michael's mom, still worried but trying to stay calm, finally asked, "What do we do now, doctor?" "We need to save Sandra." The doctor, seeing how desperate they all were, suggested a solution. "We'll have to get blood from the blood bank," he said. "It's the fastest way to help her now." Everyone nodded, agreeing that this was the best option. The confusion over the blood matching was pushed aside for the moment. The most important thing was to save Sandra. The doctor quickly made arrangements to get the blood she needed, while the families remained in the waiting room, their minds spinning with questions and worries. Part 5. After Sandra was discharged from the hospital, everyone was relieved that she was okay. The focus had shifted entirely from the wedding to Sandra's health, and the joy of the day was overshadowed by the events that had unfolded. Few days later, Sandra's dad, John, invited both Chief Nicholas's family and his own family to his house. He wanted to address the shocking discovery about Sandra's blood type and clear the air about what had happened. When everyone gathered at John's house, there was a heavy silence in the room. John took a deep breath and began. "First, I want to apologize to you, Nicholas," he said, looking at Chief Nicholas. "I am truly sorry for all the trouble and confusion." Chief Nicholas nodded, though his face was still filled with anger and sadness. John continued, "We need to get to the bottom of this. Monica, please tell us, who is the biological father of Sandra?" Monica, sitting with her head bowed, was filled with shame. She hesitated, not wanting to reveal the truth, but she could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her. After much encouragement and pleading from both families, Monica finally spoke. I think the biological father of Sandra is Nicholas," Monica said, her voice trembling. "When Nicholas sent us away, I found out I was pregnant. I was so scared. I didn't want to lose John, and I didn't know how to tell him the truth. So, I kept it a secret." The room fell silent. Everyone was in shock. Sandra looked at her mother, tears welling up in her eyes. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Michael, standing beside Sandra, looked at the floor, trying to process everything. John's face was pale as he struggled to take in the news. "You mean, I've been raising a child who isn't mine?" he asked, his voice filled with pain. Monica nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know how to tell you. I was afraid you would leave me. I was wrong to keep it from you, and I am so sorry." Chief Nicholas, looking heartbroken, turned to Monica. "You kept this secret for so long. You hurt so many people with your lies. This is more than I ever imagined." The family sat in stunned silence, the weight of the truth sinking in. Sandra, still in shock, looked at her mom and dad with tears streaming down her face, unable to answer. The room was filled with a mix of anger, sadness, and confusion as everyone tried to come to terms with the truth. The story of betrayal and secrecy had come to light, and it was clear that healing and understanding would take time. The past had caught up with them, and the future was uncertain, but for now, the families were left to deal with the emotional fallout and try to find a way forward. Michael's hands began to shake as he repeated Mr. Johnson's words in his mind. His heart pounded so loudly that it was all he could hear. With tears streaming down his face, he shouted, "Do you mean Sandra, my fiancée and wife-to-be, is my sister?" His voice cracked, heavy with disbelief and sorrow. The room fell silent as everyone stared at Michael, watching his heart shatter in front of them. He dropped to his knees, unable to stand under the weight of the words that had just been spoken. His dreams, his future, everything he had planned with Sandra flashed before his eyes, now blurred by tears. The love of his life might be his sister. It was a thought too painful to bear. Sandra, seeing Michael in so much pain, felt her own heart breaking. She wanted to rush to him, to hold him, to tell him that everything would be okay. But how could she? She was just as lost, just as confused. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "Michael." Her voice was filled with sorrow, but she could say no more. The words were stuck in her throat, trapped by the fear of what might be true. As the reality of the situation sank in, Chief Nicholas slammed his fist on the table, his face turning red with anger and frustration. "No," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "I can't believe this story. A DNA test must be conducted. We need to know the truth." His outburst startled everyone, but they all knew he was right. The uncertainty was unbearable, and only a DNA test could give them the answers they desperately needed. John, who had been standing silently in the corner, finally broke down. He had always been the strong one, the one who held the family together, but now, his strength was gone. Tears flowed freely down his face as he realized the gravity of the situation. He had watched Michael and Sandra grow close, seen the love in their eyes, and now, that love might be built on something they could never overcome. The room was filled with the sound of crying, Michael's sobs, Sandra's quiet tears, John's grief. Even Chief Nicholas, the pillar of strength, looked shaken as he paced back and forth, trying to make sense of it all. They all knew what had to be done. A date was set for the DNA test, but the days leading up to it felt like an eternity. Every second was filled with fear and uncertainty, and no one knew what the future would hold. Michael and Sandra couldn't even look at each other without their hearts breaking all over again. They had spent years dreaming of a life together, a life filled with love, laughter, and happiness. Now, all those dreams hung by a thread, depending on a test that would decide everything. As they waited for the day of the test, the house was filled with a heavy silence. Each person lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. The love that once brought them joy now brought only pain. And as the days dragged on, they could only hope that the truth, whatever it may be, would bring them some kind of peace. The day of the DNA test finally arrived, and the atmosphere was tense. Sandra, Michael, Chief Nicholas, John, Monica, and Sandra's younger brother all made their way to the clinic, each carrying the weight of their worries. The DNA samples were collected meticulously, blood samples from each individual were drawn by a skilled technician, and the samples were labeled and sent off to the lab for analysis. The days that followed were filled with anxious anticipation. The entire household was on edge, waiting for the results that could change their lives forever. Finally, the day came when the results were ready. Everyone gathered in the large sitting room, the tension palpable. Chief Nicholas sat with his hands clenched, Michael was pacing back and forth, while Sandra, her face pale, sat close to her younger brother, holding his hand tightly. John and Monica sat a little apart from the others, their expressions unreadable. The doctor, a seasoned professional with years of experience, arrived with a sealed envelope containing the test results. He greeted everyone before taking a seat at the head of the room, where all eyes were on him. He took a deep breath and began, "The DNA analysis has been completed, and I will now share the results with you." He opened the envelope and carefully unfolded the document inside. According to the results, the doctor said, his voice steady, Sandra is indeed the biological daughter of Chief Nicholas. A wave of shock rippled through the room. Michael, who had been standing, suddenly sat down as if his legs had given way. He stared at Sandra in disbelief. "Sandra, my fiancée, is my sister," he muttered, his voice breaking. The realization was too much to bear, and he burst into tears, burying his face in his hands. Sandra, equally devastated, began to cry as well. The room was filled with the sound of their sobs, echoing the heartbreak of everyone present. Chief Nicholas, struggling to process the revelation, shouted, "This can't be true. We must have another test." But the doctor raised his hand to calm the room. "There's more," he said, causing the room to fall into a heavy silence again. Everyone's attention was riveted on the doctor. He continued, "In addition to the paternity test for Sandra, we also conducted a paternity test for her younger brother. The results show that he is not John's biological son." John gasped, his face draining of color as the words sank in. He looked over at Monica, who immediately looked away, her face flushed with embarrassment. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, and she wished she could disappear. John couldn't hold back his grief. "Monica," he whispered, his voice filled with pain, "how could this happen?" The betrayal he felt was overwhelming, and he struggled to keep his emotions in check. The room erupted into chaos once again. Chief Nicholas was beside himself, trying to understand the implications of what had just been revealed. Sandra, overwhelmed by the turn of events, clung to her younger brother, tears streaming down her face. Michael was still sobbing, his heart breaking at the thought of losing both his fiancée and the life they had planned together. In the midst of the emotional turmoil, the doctor sat quietly, allowing the family to process the shocking news. The room was filled with a mix of sorrow, disbelief, and a sense of helplessness as they faced the reality of their situation. The room was filled with shock as the doctor revealed that Sandra's younger brother wasn't John's biological son. Everyone turned to look at Monica, who immediately felt embarrassed. John, overwhelmed with anger, rushed toward Monica, his eyes filled with rage. He wanted to strangle her, but Chief Nicholas and Michael held him back just in time. "Tell us, Monica," Chief Nicholas shouted, his voice trembling with both anger and sorrow. "Who is the father of Sandra's younger brother?" Monica stood there, her lips trembling, refusing to speak. She looked around the room, her eyes filled with fear and guilt. Everyone was staring at her, waiting for an answer. The pressure was too much, and finally, she broke down in tears. It's Musa," Monica whispered, barely audible. "Musa?" John exclaimed, his voice full of disbelief. "Our old gateman." Monica nodded, her face red with shame. John's heart felt like it was shattering into pieces. The pain of betrayal was too much to bear. He stumbled backward, his face pale, and then he collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Sandra rushed to her father's side, crying uncontrollably.